You know that one song you can't get enough of? Chances are it was made with a sample from Splice. Explore top packs made by your favorite producers, sketch out song ideas in seconds with Create Mode, and dive into a sample catalog that's so deep, it's dangerous. Find out why Splice is the industry's not-so-secret secret. Visit splice.com and try for free today. Welcome to the Fader Interview. I'm Alex Robert Ross, editorial director of The Fader. Hudson Mohawke may not have released a solo album in 7 years, but that doesn't mean he hasn't been busy. Since the 2015 release of Lantern, he's dropped a couple of Ravian romantic tunes with Tiga, scored a dystopian video game, and showed his versatility by working on albums by Anoni and Christina Aguilera. He's also found time to revive the much-loved Tonight alongside Lunas, delving back into the candy-coloured world of trap and EDM to deliver another batch of rowdy club bangers. Like plenty of others, Hudmo also took time during the pandemic to indulge in a little nostalgia, sharing 3 mixtapes worth of early and unreleased material, dating as far back as his teenage years in the mid-aughts. Those tapes, BBHE, Poom Gems, and Airborne Lard, represent the past, a dose of maximalist electronic admin that paved the way for the future. Taking stock of the past has been a big part of the producer's life these past few years, as he's moved from London to LA and entered rehab. So it would be wrong to describe his new album Cry Sugar as feeling like a debut. The fizzy euphoria that seeps from every track will be instantly familiar to all Hudmo fans. But his third studio effort is the first entry on a clean slate. His love of the wildly high BPM club sound of hardcore is blended with soulful gospel samples and epic movie score landscapes to create a project that's irreverent yet moving and hypnotic as well. Days after Cry Sugar's release, The Fader's David Renshaw spoke to Hudmo about the path that led to the album's creation, getting sober, American decadence, and the ways he incorporates his playful, grotesque sense of humor in his music.
Obviously, the album came out on Friday. Did you manage to celebrate in any way or like mark the occasion?
I had a giant birthday cake cheesecake and a bottle of non-alcoholic champagne. That was my celebration. It was great.
How much of Cry Sugar was born from nostalgia? Because in 2020, obviously pandemic times, you went back into the archives and released 3 mixtapes of previously unreleased material. Did that process and the kind of going back to your very early days inspire the writing for this album at all?
That kind of process of going back to those other records was basically just like, people keep asking me for these fucking old songs, and like, I don't think they're good enough to be on an album. And they were never really intended for release, but they were kind of floating around YouTube and, radio rips from mixes that were online, whatever. I just had this thought of like, I need to fucking get rid of these. I need to get these like off my chest before I go and put out a new record. So it was kind of just like I need to cleanse my whole sort of palette of what I'm going for here, because I'm not going to be able to put out a new record until these are like out in the world, and I'm not tempted to like rework some of them for a new record or something like that. One of the bigger influences on it was, first of all, like not having done shows for a long time. Even pre-pandemic, I kind of stopped doing shows around end of 2016. I was just like, I'm fucking burnt out on this. And I think when you remove the idea of like, oh, I've got to make something that like works for this festival or this club or something like that, it's a more simplified approach to make something that is sort of just for yourself. So I think that's probably the primary kind of influence here, was like being left alone to just like make a bunch of songs that make me happy, rather than like, oh, is this going to work at, is this going to be a big song? Is this like, just removing all of that gives you a lot more freedom to just make something that is like exciting to you.
And it's been 7 years since your last album, and you've obviously been busy in the interim period. Were there any other reasons for that kind of quite lengthy gap? Is making a solo record a process you enjoy particularly?
I do enjoy it, but I'm not someone who can do a solo record like every year. I don't have the urge to do that, but also I don't have the source material of like life experiences to draw on to just make another record like every fucking year, you know? There was like 7 years between my first and second albums as well, but that was like primarily touring, and we did the Tonight stuff in that interim period as well. But then I moved to America was like, yeah, end of 2016, start of 2017. And it was this period where I hadn't really like taken stock of like where I was at just like as a person for a long time. And I was like, fuck, I'm not really like mentally in a very good place. I'm kind of like been overdoing it for like quite a few years now, and I need to like probably get some help. um, so I ended up like going to rehab, doing that. That was an ongoing thing for like multiple years where I'm totally fine to talk about it, but I also like hate the idea of like people leaning into this like fucking mental health addiction aspect and like interviews and things like that because it's not, they're not unique problems. Yeah, it took me a couple of years to really get a handle on maintaining any degree of like sobriety. Thankfully got a hold of that a couple of years ago, but that obviously contributed to like part of the gap as well. And I spent a great deal of that gap also kind of in the mindset of like, I don't know if I have another album in me. I don't know if like, have I like missed the boat by just like touring too much and just being wasted all the time. So there's a lot of like, soul searching going on in that in that period as well.
Is any of that journey or those feelings that you've kind of been processing over these past few years, is that reflected in the album at all?
I think so. I think, I always kind of talk about this with my music, but I think for me making it anyways, there's those moments of like they're uplifting, but there's this kind of melancholic undertone of everything's fucked essentially and like and also just like I've fucking destroyed my own fucking life and like ruined my career and like all these thoughts that like probably are not entirely true, but I'm certainly prone to like my head going to those places. So yeah, I think a great deal of kind of sadness, I guess, and kind of mourning for myself in a way, which is, you know, um, but I guess also like trying to find some sort of like light through that, and also just the sort of profound ridiculousness of the bullshit that alcoholism takes you to and puts you through.
As someone who's kind of strikes me as being very self-aware and of kind of keen to avoid cliches and these kind of things, were you reluctant to kind of move to LA, go to rehab and become sober? Is that kind of a tricky aspect to overcome?
Oh my God. Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I think the notion of moving to LA in the first place, especially being from the UK, you have these kind of a little bit of a condescending kind of viewpoint on LA, and it does seem like a kind of cliche thing to do. On the other hand, like my dad is from here, my dad was raised in LA, and I always had this kind of thing of like, well, I'm gonna kick myself if I'm an old guy and I'm like, fuck, I never even tried being over there and like just trying to wrap my head around what it was about. And maybe I'll end up hating it, and maybe I'll love it. The first couple of years here, absolutely fucking hated it. It was just like, I've truly made like the worst decision of my life. And part of that is not even specifically LA. It's just I've been coming to the US for years and years for shows, but I think it's a big culture shock being here every day. And that takes a long time to sort of wrap your head around and become accustomed to. And it's certainly not for everyone. And I'm in a place now where I actually really love being here. At this point, I'm sort of like, no, that was a good decision, because ultimately it kind of got me back into a place of like sort of mental stability, as it were. But no, I'm obviously deeply aware of like, if I think if I had told myself I would be in this position 10 years later of like, you fucking moved to LA and became like a sober person, then I probably would have been like, no fucking way. That's the last fucking thing I'm ever going to do. For all my sort of like snarkiness and cynicism, I think I still have an element of like sort of throwing caution to the wind and being like, well, I'm going to give it a shot anyways, because I'm too kind of curious to not at least experience it for myself.
As someone who, a creative person, did part of you ever kind of think, I don't know if I can do what I do and be sober at the same time? Was there like that thing of linking the two?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I still wrestle with that. I have so many formative experiences that inform my creative work, from just being in clubs, in dark, sweaty clubs, being fucking wasted, and living for that environment and experiencing music with like some good pills or something like that. I'm never ever not going to miss that. So I do wrestle with that, and I kind of take solace in the idea that a lot of the people that I sort of look up to, they manage to carve a way through that and still experience and enjoy the nightlife aspect of it without needing the kind of the overdoing it aspect.
Were you able to speak to any of your kind of contemporaries or peers about their experiences?
Yeah, and I think also, a big part of it is that like I fucking love that environment, but I'm also like I'm a fairly like shy, quiet person generally. Sometimes I'm like, well, I need some sort of like chemical buffer there to like engage properly, like in a club environment. So that that aspect of it is difficult, and going to be going into a bunch of shows coming up soon, and I've been doing the occasional show here and there for the last couple of years, but I haven't really done any like touring, so it's still going to be an experience. But I guess the other aspect of it that I take a lot of solace from as well is that I've almost grown back into loving the sort of creation side of it more than the nightlife side of it. And I think that's kind of where everyone starts out. And I have this sort of routine now where I'm at the studio every day, and I'm working every day, and I really, that brings me like a great deal of joy. And the partying aspect of it really only came into play at the point where I started to get loads of shows. Prior to that, it was just like I fucking love sitting and making music. And I've kind of like I feel like I've kind of relearned that aspect of it, rather than like, oh, I'll do a little studio day here in between like the one day I'm at home in the middle of this tour or something like that, which isn't really the way to like tap into creating anything decent, I feel like.
So talking about influences on the album and kind of some of the ideas at play on Cry Sugar, you cited American decadence as being part of their thing. What do you kind of mean by American decadence?
Being from the UK or being from Europe, I think it's a real culture shock to just drop in at the deep end in America, and how absolutely profoundly fucking ridiculous so much of what you're bombarded with as far as advertising, as far as just like the shit you're seeing on the street day to day. It's like being in fucking Grand Theft Auto or something like that. It's fucking just insane disparities between like essentially like a shanty town with like a Ferrari driving through it or some shit like that. It's a disparity that we just don't really have. It's kind of shocking and overwhelming. I would say that like in my music and in my previous releases as well. Like I've had this sort of like it's kind of fascination with American mainstream music or mainstream pop and mainstream rap and some dance music, but it's always been like from an outsider's perspective. It's just sort of interesting to experience that firsthand. Oh, I mean, I remember when I can't. When was it? Was when the fucking Oprah William and Kate interview was on. People were watching it internationally, but they were watching like a stream of U.S. television, and all the ads in between are all ads for medicine, and the reaction to that of people being like, what the fuck is what is going on here? Why is there an ad that's telling you to ask your doctor about this medicine that you're seeing an advert for? Surely the doctor should be telling you what's gonna like cure you. Like that kind of like what the fuck is going on feeling. And I think I tried to sort of like distill some of that into the record.
I wanted to talk to you about humor and comedy within your music. You strike a balance between things that are artistically informed, but kind of also have a comic edge or shape to them a lot of the time. How hard is it to balance those things? And why do you feel that having both elements represented is so important to what you do?
I think a lot of that comes from yeah, I remember just like as a wee guy, I remember, BBC and Channel 4 and those sort of things. They had some pretty like far out comedy. Not on the sort of super mainstream shows, but I always talk about there was a show called Big Train. I think that's where like Simon Pegg and things like that started out. This Morning with Richard Not Judy, and it was Stuart Lee and I forget the other guy's name. But it was them like in their 20s, I guess, just like fucking around. It was coming from like an informed place. It wasn't just this is just sort of like wacky for the sake of silliness. It was like coming from a perspective of culturally informed and sort of politically informed, but it wasn't afraid to be just dumb at the same time. And I think we used to have a show in Scotland called Chewing the Fat as well, which was just pretty like vulgar and not like lowbrow, but coming from a place where like these people are like real masters at finding that sweet spot, and that always sort of resonated with me. I don't know. I don't really necessarily know why that was. I think I was just in a friend group that we all were like obsessed with that kind of stuff as kids. And I think to some extent, like that kind of sardonic sense of humor, and I think it's also a UK thing. I just have always gravitated towards that. I don't know. It's like trying to find that balance between like doing something that it's not joke music, like it's heartfelt. I try to make things that like resonate with me emotionally, but I've always been turned off by the notion of, well, if you're going to be making like a quote unquote like weird dance record, by default it has to be very sort of brooding and serious and shocking and deep. And first of all, I feel like that's kind of a cliche, and it's not something that particularly ever really resonated with me, because I think a lot of the best dance music is just like party music. Certainly the dance music that I love anyways, it's usually fairly like concise and like direct.
Having had quite a thoughtful discussion about humor and the ways in which we use it, we do have to mention the Cry Sugar artwork, which is a painting by Wayne Horse, which features this Stay Puft Marshmallow Man in a thong. I wondered if you could talk me through the image, how that came to be. Did you kind of approach him and he came back with that, or was it more of a collaboration? And what does that image say to you?
I approached him about it. Firstly, I'd seen some of his other work and I was really he had this tone, and I think I spent some time living in Amsterdam, and he's Dutch. I love Holland, and they have a pretty irreverent sense of humor as well. Or, I saw it in his work. There's these like incredibly like debauched scenes of like full fucking like Sodom and Gomorrah shit, but done in such a way that like it's so silly. It's kind of initially shocking and funny, but also like genuinely is kind of like sad and disturbing. um, and I kind of thought like that particular image was like it was like me like 5 years ago or something like that at the end of my like partying career. Basically.
In addition to their artwork, another key kind of visual side of this album was the Big Stan video, which is directed by Patty Harrison and Alan Resnick. I feel like you and particularly Patty Harrison have this love of the grotesque, and that video certainly has some grotesque elements in it. Is that something that you kind of wanted to reflect in around this album as well?
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing with that is like when I approached Patty about it, she was like, "Yeah, I would love to do it," but I didn't give her any like brief or anything like that. I gave her the music, and I had this kind of inkling of like, "You're gonna get this," and she fucking totally nailed it. There's so many things that she's been involved in here. Particularly, I feel like, I think you should leave. Similar kind of thing. Like they're coming from sort of funny, interesting, creative people, but they're not afraid to be shocking and silly at the same time. And I think there's that kind of that has been one of the things that I've always sort of admired about Patty's work. Patty can be like a serious actress as well, and often see her in situations that you might associate with like high culture, Vogue, and all this kind of thing. And I love the fact that she was finding that sweet spot as well of like being quite sort of publicly prominent in the art world and in fashion to some degree, but still, again, unafraid to sort of do silly shit.
I'm just searching for freedom when I call out your name. Call out your name. Call out your name.
I wanted to talk about a couple of tracks on the album that stood out to me, which were Intention and Some Buzz, both of which feature gospel choirs. And I was curious as to how you felt about the use of that kind of overtly religious music in what you do, because it feels quite euphoric in the same way that, say, a synth drop on Tonight's music does. But also it does come with certain baggage, be it like say religious or cultural. I just wondered how you kind of approached that sonic part of the record.
I certainly didn't want to do anything that is overtly religious per se. And I've had a couple of like interviews ask me about this, and the deepest amount of thought that I gave it was really that I love sampling, and a lot of the music that I've sampled over the years tends to be soul records, gospel records, not so much jazz records, but all kind of black music essentially. And that has always tended to be, for whatever reason, the music that has the little parts of songs that prick my ears up and get my attention as far as like looking for samples. I can't say that there was any real thought as to like, oh, this is going to come across as like a religious type thing. I think because, if you go back to the first sort of beat tape that I ever put out as Hudson Mohawke, and that was 2006 or something, it's all just fucking soul samples, everything's chopped up, but it's all soul samples. And that I think is and has been kind of like a foundational aspect of my music. And I think, most of that came from like being really into DJ Premier and Pete Rock and Just Blaze and like these guys that come from that era of like sample based rap and sample based hip hop. I've always just loved that kind of music, so there really wasn't any deeper kind of thought in it than that, to be honest.
You worked with Chad Hugo of the Neptunes on Redeem.
Yeah! Wait a minute. I just want to prove to you I've been redeemed.
What's your relationship with him like, and what did he bring to the process?
The sample on there's a gospel sample on that, and it's probably the most overt. It's like a recording of a gospel in like a church ceremony. And funnily enough, the people who own the rights to that sample are the only people who are being like real pricks about not clearing it and wanting like a lot of money. But no, we worked on that one together. I think, I sort of came of age, right at that era where the Neptunes were just starting to become a thing. And you had this thing going on that these two guys are making this music which really like shouldn't work as pop music. It's really kind of like, if you listen to some of those instrumentals just by themselves, they're pretty like far out. Them making them work as pop records, and then subsequently over the course of like a couple of years becoming like the primary sound of like chart radio, with something that up to that point was like highly unconventional as far as popular music. And they were just such fucking good records as well. Like even all those fucking clip songs from then, and and I remember at the time as well, like I remember hearing, what year did Drop It Like It's Hot come out? Like 2003 or something, or maybe before that. I always rave about these guys, Optimo in Glasgow, these two DJs in Glasgow that had this sort of like, legendary club night on a Sunday night. People stayed at till 3, 4, 5 in the morning, even with work the next day. Obviously, I'd heard that song on the radio, whatever else, but I remember hearing that just as an instrumental in the middle of like, a techno set in a club, and it working and being like, this shouldn't work in this environment either. And it totally works here as well. And that kind of aspect of it as well, that like this sort of like raw drum machine programmed, kind of rigid, stark instrumental can work in like this environment as well. That was always really interesting to me. Like it kind of worked in all these different contexts, as well as just those just being like great songs. I was always like super, very, very into that, and very inspired by that, how they were able to do that.
Another kind of often cited reference by yourself is people who scored movies, kind of classic movies, Vangelis, John Carpenter, and the like. I was curious, what movies were you watching during the making of Cry Sugar, and do you feel that any in particular have made their way into the sound of the record?
What movies was I watching? I fucking go to the cinema like twice a week, and I struggle to fucking remember anything offhand that I've fucking seen. I remember that there's this piece by Max Richter called On the Subject of Daylight, and I remember hearing it. I think it was in Shutter Island. It was in that, and then it was in something else as well. It was in like Arrival or one of those movies. And I remember hearing that and being like, what the fuck is that? And it also having like it's a real like tearjerker of a song, And I think that that is something that I always gravitate towards. Like if something can like reduce me to tears, I fucking love it. And that song is a couple of other pieces by him like very much resonated with me. And I think I kind of vaguely tried to do something like that there's a song on the album called Stump, which is just a kind of instrumental synth track with no drums or anything on it. And that was the kind of inspiration for that. And a recent one, which I think is fucking excellent, is Nathan McKay, who has been doing the score for Industry just now. It's fucking excellent. And I briefly was speaking to him about it, and he was talking about like, yeah, I can't believe they've let me get away with like some of the things I've got in there. It's so fucking great to like hear interesting shit like that, like on like mainstream TV as well. And then I think you also obviously have like, Dan OPN's been doing some really interesting scoring stuff. Hacks and Cloak done some like excellent shit.
I mean, is it an avenue you're keen to pursue? Is that something we could see down the line? I heard Mo film score.
I would like to do it. I did this thing earlier this year. I mean, I've done some like video game scoring in the past. I did a thing earlier in the year which was like this sort of hybrid live production of Jekyll and Hyde by National Theatre, and I did the score for that. I think the aspect of it that turns me off is this kind of endless like running changes, and the idea of like you might really, really love something, but like ultimately it's not your decision, and that's a kind of selfish way to look at it. But I think that aspect of it, and from speaking to friends who are in that world, can be a pretty like unrelenting and thankless kind of pursuit. But from a creative standpoint, I would love to attempt something like that. Yeah.
One of my favorite things online in recent years has been your posts about Tonight, when you use a picture of like just a completely separate white guy and a black guy. Obviously there's been like, I'm looking at one now of Malcolm in the Middle and Bow Wow, and there's a really good one of Prince Philip and DMX. I was just wondering if you had any particular favorite alter ego Tonights.
Let me have a look just now.
The Prince Philip DMX one is hilarious.
That was great because I think that came from, they both died on the same weekend, and so there was all these articles going around. This one of Skepta and Adele is pretty good. Oh, the one of I think it's from Conan or something like that. The one of Arnie and Grace Jones.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, that's my final question. I saved the big ones for last.
Oh, great.
Thank you.
Oh, Bill Clinton and Jay-Z is pretty good as well.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. And like I said, congratulations on Cry Sugar. It's fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.
That was Hudson Mohawke talking to the Fader's David Renshaw. Hudson Mohawke's new album, Cry Sugar, is out now via Warp. The Fader interview is engineered by Tony Giambroni. The executive producer is Alex Robert Ross, and the associate producer is Raphael Helfand. We'd like to thank Loughton Audio for providing our microphones. You can find them online at lautenaudio.com. And we'd like to thank James Ivey for providing our intro music. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd appreciate if you left a 5-star rating and review. If you like listening to The Fader, good news. We're now on the new live radio app, AMP. You can download it from the App Store now. And keep an eye on thefader.com for essential music news, interviews, and essays. We'll be back soon with another episode of The Fader Interview. Goodbye until then. You know that one song you can't get enough of? Chances are it was made with a sample from Splice. Explore top packs made by your favorite producers, sketch out song ideas in seconds with Create Mode, and dive into a sample catalog that's so deep, it's dangerous. Find out why Splice is the industry's not-so-secret secret. Visit splice.com and try for free today.